Ute, ich erreiche euch gerade nicht, ich bin abgestürzt.
So it is one. Welcome to everyone. Just before we start.
Ute, ich erreiche euch gerade nicht, ich bin abgestürzt.
Hello?
Okay, I think you need to mute yourself.
So it is one. Welcome to everyone. Just before we start.
Ute, ich erreiche euch gerade nicht, ich bin abgestürzt.
Hello? Yeah, so you have down on the little globe option different languages that you can switch to: English, German, French, and Spanish. The first speaker will be speaking in German, so if you need interpretation, you can already change the channel. And I would like to remind you that this webinar is streamed and recorded. Özlem, you have the floor whenever you want.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are gonna wait for some minutes because our first AR introduction is going to take like few seconds to start. But meanwhile, we invite you all to use the chat box and to share some information that is important and relevant for us as part of the peace movement. Thank you very much for your patience.
Könnt ihr mich hören? Könnt ihr mich hören?
Ja, ohne Probleme.
Okay, herzlichen Dank. Ich nehme an, dass ich jetzt dran bin zum Eröffnen. Ich bitte um Entschuldigung. Ich habe gerade ein komplett eingefrorenes Bildschirm vor mir. Das heißt, ich kann euch nicht sehen und hören. Ich weiß nicht, ob ihr mich sehen könnt, aber ich möchte euch alle herzlich begrüßen zu unserer Konferenz heute. Wegen des NATO-Gipfels auch heute zeitgleich in Brüssel. Ich freue mich, dass wir zusammenkommen können, auch in diesen Pandemiezeiten, denn es ist tatsächlich wichtig, derzeit zusammenzukommen und darüber zu sprechen, was getan werden muss, um den Frieden in der Welt zu erhalten. Und ich würde mir eigentlich wünschen, dass wir zusammenkommen könnten, auch physisch und nicht nur in einer digitalen Plattform. Und ich finde, dass diese Pandemie uns aktuell ja auch gezeigt hat, worum es tatsächlich geht, was echte Sicherheit bedeutet und was wir brauchen, um wirklich frei und sicher leben zu können. Und das ist nicht Aufrüsten, das ist nicht immer mehr größere Militärbudgets, sondern das bedeutet eigentlich Investitionen in eine soziale Infrastruktur, Investitionen in die Gesundheitsversorgung aller Menschen. Und das wird nicht gemacht. Obwohl wir in der größten Pandemie sind, an die wir uns alle gemeinsam erinnern können, ist es so, dass derzeit in den verschiedenen Mitgliedstaaten der Europäischen Union und weltweit betrachtet immer mehr für Aufrüstung ausgegeben wird. Und das ist falsch. Wir sprechen über das 2%-Ziel der NATO. Ja, und wir kritisieren dieses 2%-Ziel der NATO, denn dieses Ziel wird nicht dazu beitragen, dass wir den Frieden in der Welt verteidigen, sondern umgekehrt. Aber es ist nicht nur die NATO, es ist auch die Europäische Union, die immer weiter aufrüstet, mit PESCO und so weiter. Ist es so, dass Mitgliedstaaten der Europäischen Union sich verpflichten, auch kontinuierlich immer mehr Geld für Aufrüstung auszugeben. Erstmalig hat sich die Europäische Union in dieser Pandemie einen Haushalt geleistet, in dem mehrere Militärbudgets enthalten sind. Der Verteidigungsfonds, die militärische Mobilität und auch die Aufrüstung im Weltall, das ist die Realität, die derzeit auf europäischer Ebene gemacht wird. Und das ist keine Sicherheitspolitik, das unterstreichen wir. Denn die Investitionen in noch größeres, noch schnelleres, noch intelligenteres Kriegsgerät wird nicht dazu beitragen, dass die Diplomatie erstarkt, dass der Friedensprozess im globalen Kontext weiter befördert wird, sondern eher, dass auch die Aufrüstungsspirale immer weiter auch eine Unsicherheit in die Welt bringen. Wer, wenn nicht wir in Europa, wissen, was das bedeuten kann. Es ist aber auch so, dass wir in den letzten Jahren als Friedensbewegung durchaus Erfolge hatten. Ich möchte erinnern an den Atomwaffenverbotsvertrag, der wirklich ein Fortschritt ist. Aber dieser Atomwaffenverbotsvertrag wird von der NATO eben nicht begrüßt, wird von NATO-Mitgliedstaaten eben verhindert. Und ich glaube, da heißt es für uns alle gemeinsam noch stärker auch für die nukleare Abrüstung eintreten. Auf diesem NATO-Gipfel wird ein neuer Feind gefunden. Das Signal wird relativ deutlich werden. Amerika unter Biden ist weg und mit Amerika unter Biden ist die NATO, die in den letzten Jahren zerstrittener wirkte, doch wieder geeint. Und für diese Einigung braucht man auch aktuell wieder neue Feindbilder. Wir kennen das schon aus der Vergangenheit. Und eines dieser Feindbilder, wenn nicht das Hauptfeindbild, wird China sein. Und wir finden das brandgefährlich, was hier passiert. Warum wird China ausgesucht? Natürlich nicht willkürlich. China ist eine große ökonomische Macht, die immer stärker wird. Und auch die USA und NATO-Mitgliedstaaten wissen, um politisch die Nummer 1 zu sein, muss man auch ökonomisch die Nummer 1 bleiben. Und wenn die NATO-Mitgliedstaaten vielleicht heute oder in den nächsten Tagen mit einem Signal des Geeintseins rausgehen werden, dann wissen wir, dass dieses Geeintsein nicht es sein wird, dass sie wirklich inhaltlich ihre eigenen Widersprüche überwunden haben, sondern dass sie sich einig sind, dass sie für die Absatzmärkte, an der Beteiligung der Absatzmärkte und ihre ökonomischen Interessen doch gewichtiger sind und den größeren Teil des Kuchens bekommen. Frieden aber bedeutet etwas anderes. Frieden bedeutet Abrüstungsbestrebungen. Frieden bedeutet Diplomatie statt Eskalation. Frieden bedeutet, Konflikte in der Welt tatsächlich nachhaltig, gerecht und friedlich zu lösen. Und dafür gibt sich die NATO eben keine Aufgabe und dafür verdient die NATO massiv unsere Kritik, denn wir wissen, dass Krieg tatsächlich nur die Fortführung einer gescheiterten Politik sein kann. Und wir wollen keine gescheiterte Politik. Wir wollen nicht Leid, Elend, Krieg, Hunger, Tod in alle Welt bringen. Das bedeutet nicht Krieg, sondern wir wollen Frieden stärken. Und dafür setzen wir uns dafür ein, dass wir nachhaltig, international mehr Diplomatie sehen können. Und deshalb setzen wir uns ein, dass Abrüstung nach vorne gestellt wird. Ich möchte uns allen heute eine gute Konferenz wünschen. Und noch wichtiger, ich möchte uns heute allen wünschen, dass wir uns gut vernetzen können, dass wir in den nächsten Jahren wirklich noch stärker, noch dominanter, noch durchschlagskräftiger als Friedensbewegung eintreten können, um den Frieden in der Welt zu verteidigen. Und in dem Sinne möchte ich jetzt weitergeben das Wort an Jessica Pardo von der vom Internationalen Friedensbüro, die das folgende Panel moderieren wird.
Thank you very much, Özlem, for your very important and fantastic words to introduce the panel. As we know, today's webinar is about joining our forces against NATO. During this event, we will discuss how we can challenge NATO and promote human security. I'm very honored today to be joined by our 4 panelists who have intensively worked on peace actions and the fight against NATO. So let's start with the presentations. I'm very pleased to present our first speaker, Sean Conner. Sean holds a bachelor's degree in intercultural communication and a master's degree in intercultural conflict management. He's the international coordinator for the World Peace Congress 2021 at the International Peace Bureau. And he has worked in some countries as Nicaragua on community development. So Sean, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jessica. So my talk today is focused on nuclear abolition and common security. I've just recently come from the launch of the Common Security 2022 Commission, which I'll post a link to later in the chats for those who are interested in learning more about that. Common security is a very important initiative and fits right into our conversation today on the dissolution of NATO. But to start with some basic facts about the current nuclear dilemma we're in, or this quite awful situation. Just in the last week, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, shared that $72.6 billion were spent on nuclear weapons in 2020. NATO countries alone, specifically the United States, United Kingdom, and France, spent 49.3 billion, or over 2/3 of the total nuclear weapons spending. The total number of nuclear weapons is estimated to be around 14,000, and again, over half of these are coming from within the NATO alliance. NATO is also the only alliance to allow the practice of nuclear sharing, where Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey all host the alliance's nuclear weapons. NATO claims that its purpose is to guarantee the freedom and security of its members through political and military means, for those that believe nuclear deterrence to be an effective policy, and for those that limit the meaning of security to the narrowest definition of military strength and superiority, they can defend this. But we know that this was never truly the case. Even during the Reagan administration, which initially pursued a nuclear arms buildup against the Soviet Union, Reagan feared the danger of nuclear war and eventually entered into discussions with Gorbachev that would lead to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or the INF Treaty. I use this example not to praise Reagan or his strategies, but to acknowledge two central points. One, even those who engage in a nuclear arms race are convinced that mutually assured destruction alone will not prevent nuclear war. And two, the only strategy to reduce nuclear weapons is to engage in diplomacy and dialogue, not through an arms race. Even prior to Reagan's change of heart, the Palme Commission in Europe developed a framework including these points under the title Common Security, a Blueprint for Survival. This document made clear that no country can attain true security on its own. As long as the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, the US could not be secure, and vice versa. In other words, you cannot prevent nuclear war with nuclear weapons. A nuclear arms race does nothing to secure either side and only increases the risk that such a weapon will be used. Therefore, the only way to create true security is through understanding that one state's security is interdependent with that of every other state. Diplomacy, negotiations, communication contribute more to security than any nuclear weapon ever could. With the end of the Cold War, the Palme Commission's report was nearly forgotten, although its recommendations were included in the Charter of Paris for a New Europe, signed in 1990, which established a foundation for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE, and the common security through that has survived to a certain degree. However, its recommendations for diplomacy and dialogue were limited beyond that. Nonetheless, the past 2 decades in particular have seen a new rise in global tensions and a response that is primarily, if not solely, military in nature. NATO has, of course, been at the forefront of the global militarization, representing 56% of all global military spending in 2020, according to the SIPRI figures released earlier this year. Common security inherently demands disarmament, both conventional and nuclear. Now, rather than an arms race between European nations, we see NATO as a leading player in a new arms race, both increasing conventional and nuclear weapons at a rate unmatched by any other alliance or region, let alone a single country. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg continues to justify a nuclear alliance by arguing that nuclear weapons, quote, play a vital role in preserving peace by acting as the strongest deterrent. He blames non-NATO nations for preventing the complete nuclear disarmament, while not mentioning the dominance in nuclear spending and number of nuclear weapons that is within the NATO alliance. He asserts that, quote, only 3 NATO allies possess nuclear weapons, while ignoring the nuclear sharing that provides these weapons to 5 additional NATO countries. I have to wonder if, like Reagan, Stoltenberg understands that nuclear deterrence cannot and will not prevent nuclear war, that pointing fingers and accusing others is not a diplomatic solution to rising nuclear spending, and that merely using other nations as scapegoats does not excuse NATO from its responsibilities under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. After all, could China, Russia, and other nuclear and non-nuclear nations not say the same thing about NATO? If NATO's mission, as stated, is to be the security of its members, then common security must be the starting point. Stoltenberg and NATO must be convinced that we cannot be safe as long as our comrades in China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and beyond are not safe. Or more accurately, the entire world cannot be safe until we abolish nuclear weapons. NATO, as the leading military presence, the largest military spender, and possessor of nuclear weapons, must lead the charge for nuclear abolition and wider disarmament, rather than blaming other nations for not doing the same. As a self-described, quote, political and military alliance, it is time to focus on the political aspect, specifically good faith diplomacy and negotiations for complete nuclear abolition and beyond. This means adherence not only to the NPT, but also to the newly enforced Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW, and a universal no first use policy. NATO can immediately begin with gestures of goodwill by establishing their own no first use policy, sharply reducing their arsenal of nuclear weapons, and ending their criticism and active campaign against the TPNW. Furthermore, a new common security policy must address the international challenges of the modern times that were not at the forefront of common security in the 1980s. This includes climate change, collaboration against diseases and viruses, and global inequality, among plenty of other challenges. Together with nuclear abolition, these areas will ensure our collective survival and emphasize what we've known for generations. We are only secure if all of us are secure. These negotiations will inherently mean an end to NATO as we know it, although it may take some time. It is clear that such a political military institution such as NATO cannot exist under a 21st century common security policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sean, for your excellent words. And now it's time to present our second speaker, Micaela Nondo-Erscott. Micaela is a researcher at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. She's also on the coordination committee of No Cold War, an anti-imperialist peace platform. She works closely with educational programming in the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa and other progressive organizations who endorse the declaration and platform of the Anti-Imperialist League of Action. So please, let's welcome Micaela. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you to our hosts who've sponsored the event, as well as the coordination of No War, No to NATO. My apologies for being late and not showing my face initially, but you know, organizational work keeps going even though we have all these other duties to perform. So I'm gonna be talking a little bit, and my contribution will be based on the position of the International Week of Anti-Imperialist Struggle, which emerges from people's movements, organizations, political organizations, and different networks across the globe, which largely constitute, whether it's youth, peasant organizations, feminist organizations, trade unions, that understand that the realities that they face, the inequalities that we face, cannot be transformed without coordinated anti-imperialist action that confronts the armed elements of imperialism, which are NATO and the US-led war machinery across the globe. I also will speak a little bit from the perspective of Africa, which is my continent, based in South Africa, coming from trade union background with the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. So I'll probably repeat a few of the things that I think the speaker from yesterday, Rene, no, I'm blanking on his name, but there was a speaker yesterday who spoke a little bit about NATO and Africa, but I think it bears repetition because of the significance of what happens in Africa. So as many would have said yesterday, and I've been saying over the years, we live in a time of huge instability and uncertainty about the future of humanity and of the planet. And we know that this arises, or most of us, many of us, assert that this arises from a systemic crisis that's produced daily by the demands of capitalism. The current offensive that we're enduring of capital eroding our ability to control, you know, our common fruits in terms of collective labor, common natural resources, social and intellectual resources. It also is an attack on, of course, human rights, what democracy truly should mean, and in the context of Africa, particularly on the principles of equity and national sovereignty. This has been coordinated, we know, by these huge monopolistic transnational corporate powers, and they use various forms of disinformation, particularly in the African continent, to retain a neocolonial organization in the society. And as I mentioned, we've seen this most clearly, I think, in Africa as a very clear context of the necessity of the dissolution of NATO. And through the collaboration with an organization called the Socialist Forum of Ghana, and my research organization that Jessica mentioned, the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, which has been doing amazing work grounded in social movements, anti-imperialist struggles across the world, we will be launching a dossier in July that's titled Defending Our Sovereignty, US Military Bases in Africa and the Future of African Unity. And I want to talk about some of the points that come from this so that we wanted to ventilate, because it precisely talks to the issues that NATO stands in the way of, which we look at the case study of US militarism and the various bases on the African continent and how they operate in order to understand not only the logic and practices of organizations like NATO, but how the enduring presence of foreign military bases in Africa continues to fragment and weaken not only African state institutions, but it also prevents African unity and full sovereignty from really coming to the fore, and of course undermines any forms of grassroots organization because they are in collaboration with African states that are desperate to retain some form of allegiance to the dominant economic forces across the world. And I just wanted to share two examples as it relates to the African Union, so people who maybe aren't familiar with Africa can understand what's at stake in terms of the security question and the peace question. Is in terms of, if we think about how the Peace and Security Council of the African Union is largely ineffective in terms of preventing the various conflicts that arise on the African continent, two of the central elements that are a huge problem is, one, there's an internal fragmentation amongst African states. And I mean, many of us will argue this goes back to the kind of compromise made in the 1960s at the formation of the Organization for African Unity in 1963, where we had a more radical sector calling for more radical demands that involved, federating the African state. And there was a counter group that basically wanted a more moderate, what would become the premise of a neoliberal approach to continental integration. But one is we have internal fragmentation and then we have external pressures. And if I can just give two examples, and Jessica, I hope when I have 1 minute left, you'll just wave at me because I could talk on and on and on, is one, if we look at the case of Burundi. So in early 2016, the Peace and Security Council of the AU decided to deploy 5,000 troops to kind of do a prevention and protection mission in Burundi. And this was due to the kind of long-lasting conflict in the Great Lakes region since the Burundian Civil War from 1993 to 2005. But during this process, the then president, who has been suffocating the political system and undermining popular public protests for decades, he basically pushed back against this agenda, and he pushed for other African Union leaders to not allow for the deployment of these troops in the purpose of trying to establish even, minimum liberal understandings of peace. And this is just one example where within the African Union, there is so much disunity around what the kind of ideological objectives are and how we build our own sense of self-determination. Then in terms of thinking about NATO and the kind of external pressures, let's take the example of Libya. Just a few months before the bombing of Libya under NATO, we had in February, March of 2011, we had the PSC, the Peace and Security Council mission. They basically had a plan. They had an elegant plan, a 4-point plan, where they wanted to see to it that they could get to Libya. They could allow for the cessation of certain hostilities, delivering of various, humanitarian aid and cooperation. They had proposed different political reforms that would actually eliminate the causes of the crisis. And they had decided, let's do this in our hands, whether or not we criticize the actual contents of the plan. This was supposed to be coming from an African-led independent body. But just days before they made their trip to Libya, to Tripoli, this is when the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the UN Security Council, based on the resolution of 1973, decided to go in on humanitarian intervention. They acted very quickly, way outside of their actual mandate. There was immense use of violence, and this resulted in huge civilian casualties. I have 2 minutes, sure. But the example of this is just to show that in a moment in which there was a potential for Africa to use their own implements to actually address the situation, NATO steps in and does what it wants to do and tramples over it. And this is, from that moment on, we've seen the same thing, and we've only seen an expansion of US and foreign military presences, whether it's the French-led G5 in the Sahel that has grown different military facilities across the African continent, whether it's the United States who completed a huge drone base in Agadez in Niger that doesn't happen to be very far from one of the biggest uranium deposits on the continent. And so we could look at the footprint of the US military presence in Africa, which we detail in this dossier. I hope all of you will check us out at Tricontinental and examine it. But more than anything, it tries to establish that there is a much greater scale of foreign bases in Africa that go undeterred by Africans themselves, unfortunately, because of the kind of neo-colonial dependencies. Number two is that the character of these military facilities are acting as the kind of guarantors of capital flows. So they always are located to mineral resources, natural resources, and they often operate unfettered. And number three is that in this process of laying the grounds in Africa, they also are increasing, as many of our other colleagues have said, increasing the idea of competition with China in this kind of new Cold War, as some people are calling it, where in an attempt to control African markets, they are exerting their military presence. So, I mean, I only have 1 minute to kind of sum up, but for us in the anti-imperialist week of action, who represent, again, from people like the National Union of Metalworkers in South Africa to the excluded workers in Argentina, we have over 250 people who've signed on to our declaration that basically says that if we're going to transform society for sustainability and peace, we have to have coordinated anti-imperialist actions that will serve to not only, one, educate the African populations about what the effect of foreign military bases and foreign military interests in our continent actually means, but also helps to build up a united, coordinated force of action by different organizations in the global south. And we, of course, endorse, like many of you here, the dissolution of NATO, the withdrawal of thousands of military bases across our global south nations, total disarmament, the end of all actions of intervention and external aggression that disrespect the sovereignty of various states, unless it's coming from the African Union's united position, which again, they're a weaker form of what they could actually be doing. And also, of course, the respecting of various, minimum UN charters and international laws. So, because we know that all global resources should actually be used to be addressing problems of hunger, of sickness, of unemployment. In Africa, a very young country or continent with, huge, my time is over, with huge unemployment amongst a dominantly young population. We know that our resources should not be going towards militarization, but should be invested in public resources and public goods. And that's the basis upon which our organizations continue to mobilize and continue to bring in the question of militarism into our different sectors, whether it's feminist work, whether it's agroecological work, whether it's educational work. I hope that was clear, and apologies again for how quickly I speak. Hope that the question and answer can be a bit more engaging.
Thank you very much, Micaela, for your presentation and provide a really great context on the situation in Africa. Now we invite our third speaker, Tamara Lorinks. Tamara is a PhD candidate in global governance at the Balsillie School for International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier University. She has also a master's in international politics and security studies from the University of Bradford, and a law degree, an MBA specializing in environmental law and management. Her research is on the climate and environmental impacts of the military. She's a member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Tamara is on the advisory committee of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, War Beyond War, and the No to NATO Network. So please, Tamara, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. It's really nice to be with you all. So I'm speaking to you from Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. Just before I launch into my presentation, I would like to thank my other panelists and add to what Sean said about nuclear weapons. It's because of Canada's membership in NATO that Canada is not joining the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And I would like to add to what Micaela said, that it's Canada that is contributing to the militarization of the African continent. And it was Canada that led the NATO bombing of Libya in 2011 that led to the humanitarian and refugee crisis across North Africa and into the Mediterranean. So Canada is very much complicit in the growing militarization of the African continent.
I'm going to talk about how NATO is undermining the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and how NATO is blocking progress on the Paris Agreement. But first, I want to talk briefly about First Nations communities in Canada and the relationship to NATO. The city that I live in, Waterloo, is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the neutral peoples along the Grand River. It is the Indigenous people in Canada and across Turtle Island who are leading actions to protect the natural environment. You might have heard in the news of the big protests on Vancouver Island right now in British Columbia to stop the logging of the last remaining stand of old growth forest in the province. It is the Pachida First Nations that is on the front line of that struggle. There are hundreds and hundreds of peace activists that are and First Nations that are peacefully protesting and blocking the logging roads, but there has been mass protests by the federal government and the provincial government. You may have also heard in the news that there were 250 bodies of dead children found buried in an unmarked area of an old residential school in British Columbia. For over 100 years, Indigenous children were taken from their families and forced into residential schools in Canada, where they were abused, beaten, and sometimes killed. It is a terrible injustice, but foreign policy starts at home, and our domestic policy is related to Canadian foreign policy and what we are doing in NATO. And this injustice is continuing. Today, the government of Justin Trudeau is in court fighting First Nations children because the federal government doesn't want to provide equitable healthcare and education for them, the same services that are provided to non-Indigenous children in this country. And right now in Canada, there are approximately 50 First Nations communities that do not have clean and safe drinking water. They are under a boil water advisory. Many First Nations communities do not have safe housing, and they do not have adequate health services. Last year, during the pandemic, First Nations communities called on the government of Justin Trudeau to bring in Cuban doctors and nurses into the country to help them because they have no or very few nurses, doctors, and health clinics. But the Trudeau government refused their request. A few years ago, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples came to Canada, and he was shocked at what he saw. He said the socioeconomic condition of many First Nations communities living on reserves across the country are akin to third world conditions. So while Canada has impoverished First Nations communities, the government has massively increased the military budget because of our membership in NATO. In April of this year, the government of Canada introduced its new budget, and what was one of the main priorities? More funding for NATO. So while Indigenous people in Canada, they live in dilapidated houses with no heat and no running water, and right now there are 235,000 homeless people across the country. They are living on the streets. The Trudeau government announced $19 billion for 88 new fighter jets, and most likely Canada will buy the F-35s. And this is the second largest government procurement in Canadian history. And it is because of our membership in NATO that Canada is buying new fighter jets. So this is the pattern in every NATO country. Vulnerable people, Indigenous people, the poor, the environment are being sacrificed for NATO. Poverty and homelessness are getting worse in Canada, the United States, the UK, France, and other NATO countries. As many of you know, at the Wales Summit in 2014, NATO members made a commitment to spend 2% of GDP on their militaries by 2024. And of that amount, 20% is supposed to be spent on new weapon systems to stay interoperable, especially to stay interoperable with the United States that dominates the alliance. NATO, and especially the United States, is constantly pushing countries to spend more on their militaries. And this is because NATO serves as a guaranteed market for US weapons. On Friday, NATO released its updated defense expenditure report. And this year, the 30 members of NATO plan to spend an estimated $1.12 trillion on their militaries. And as Sean said, this is 56% of global military spending. And this is going to continue to go up unless we stop it. But over the past 5 years, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is constantly saying how NATO members have increased the military budgets by $200 billion. Now, just imagine if we had invested that money instead in affordable housing, water systems, healthcare, medical services, and pandemic readiness. We would have been able to deal with the coronavirus and prevent all of these deaths that we've seen around the world. So what NATO is doing, as Michaela said, is militarizing the world, and NATO is impoverishing the world, and it's going to get worse unless we stop it. At the top of the NATO agenda today is NATO's new campaign called NATO 2030, United for a New Era. NATO 2030 is a dangerous expansion plan for the alliance over the next decade. It is a plan to expand the alliance militarily, politically, financially, and geographically. NATO 2030 is a blueprint for a new Cold War. It inflates the threat posed by Russia and China, and it's really used to justify NATO's continued existence. Worse, NATO 2030 is in direct conflict with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. In 2015, the international community adopted the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's called Agenda 2030, Transforming Our World. Some of these are some of the goals. For instance, the first goal, end poverty and hunger, achieve gender equality, provide clean water and sanitation, affordable housing and clean energy, reduce inequality, take climate action, and have peace, justice, and strong institution, among other goals. It will cost the international community approximately $3 trillion every year until 2030 to achieve the SDGs. This is roughly equivalent to global military spending. But NATO is preventing the international community from achieving these 17 goals because it's diverting public funding to militarism. NATO 2030 is also going to make it impossible for the international community to achieve the Paris Agreement by 2030. In March of this year, the United Nations World Meteorological Organization released its annual report, State of the Global Climate. The WMO report explained that climate change is worsening. It's resulting in unprecedented extreme weather events that are causing death and destruction around the world. Forest fires in Russia and Australia, heat waves in Europe, droughts in the United States, forest fires in my country. At the press conference when the report was released 2 months ago, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, "The world is on the verge of a climate abyss." He reminded the international community that we must rapidly decarbonize. Last year was one of the 3 hottest years on record. Global mean temperature rise is at 1.2 degrees Celsius. But as you know from the Paris Agreement, we have to try to keep global mean temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius to avert catastrophic climate change. So this means we have to stop burning fossil fuels. But NATO, its weapon systems and its operations consume excessive fossil fuel and emit excessive carbon emissions. And NATO weapon systems like its tanks and fighter jets are also ecologically destructive. So right now, there is a massive NATO war exercise on Steadfast Defender 2021. There are thousands of troops, fighter jets, warships that are involved. And on social media, you can see NATO soldiers in these tanks. They're wrecking the land. There are snipers in trenches, and there are fighter jets flying. All of this is bad for the natural environment and the climate. At the NATO summit, though, leaders promised to achieve net zero emissions, but they have no plan to offset the emissions from their military. You know, how many trees is it going to cost? How many trees do we need to plant? How much is that going to cost to offset the emissions from Steadfast Defender 2021? There is no plan to do this. Moreover, all of our countries are not fully and transparently reporting military emissions. It is absolutely urgent that we oppose NATO 2030. We cannot achieve the Paris Agreement climate targets, and we can't achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals if we continue with NATO's carbon-intensive militarism and military spending. I also want to stress that NATO undermines the United Nations. It circumvents the UN Security Council, and NATO foments conflict and prevents global cooperation that we so desperately need. So it is imperative that we build opposition to NATO in every country. We need to delegitimize it. We need to change the discourse that says the alliance provides security. NATO has proven to be totally useless during the pandemic, and it is exacerbating the climate crisis. In Canada, the organization that I'm with, the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, we have a campaign called Feminists Against Militarism, Women Say No to NATO, and we've protested outside of the NATO Association of Canada office every month. Tonight in Canada, we are hosting a virtual No to NATO counter summit. We have peace activists from across the country who are participating. So we are trying to build a national resistance to NATO in Canada, and we need you to do that in your country, and we need to have global solidarity to support one another. And finally, I want to remind everybody that most of the world is not in NATO. There are alternatives to the alliance. We have nonviolent conflict resolution, we have international law, we have diplomacy. There is also neutrality and the non-aligned movement. We have, of course, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe that includes all the European countries along with Russia. We also have the United Nations, of course, which is the platform that brings all the countries together. So to dismantle NATO, we need global solidarity across movements and with Indigenous people. That's how we will transform to a world of peace and justice. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tamara, for your presentation. It was very great. And yeah, thank you very much. And now we are going to introduce our last panelist, Kiki Sanchez. Kiki holds a Bachelor in Political Science and a Master's degree in International Peace, Conflict, and Development Studies. His career, activism, and research are dedicated to peace building, human rights, and social and environmental justice. He works as a project manager in Centre de Lazo of Peace Studies and is part of the IPV Barcelona office team, which leads IPV's global campaign on military spending, GCOMS, and co-organizes the Barcelona World Peace Congress in October 2021. Kike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you to all the panelists. I'm going to try to build up on the amazing interventions that you've done. I'll try not to repeat any of the points, but I would like to bring in the perspective of the campaign that we coordinate from here, the Global Campaign on Military Spending, which has NATO as one of our biggest rivals in terms of discourse, because NATO is the most visible and the most explicit driver of military spending and of military spending in crisis. Our campaign intends to raise awareness on the excessive amount of public money that we're spending year after year on the military. And we intend to change the discourse level, but also policies and budget decision making. When the reason we question military spending is, first of all, because we know our history, because we know the history lessons. We know where it leads, arms racing and military bloat, what it has led in the past and what is driving us now. We also believe that the deterrence and brinkmanship policies politics do not work, and they can only lead to disaster. We're also aware that the interests of the military-industrial complex are huge, and their lobbying efforts are huge. And as Eisenhower warned already 70 years ago, their interests are very far from those of the people and those of our countries. We also question homeland or national security approaches because we believe that it identifies many threats that the military cannot solve. For example, cyber attacks, terrorism, organized crime, which are not which should not be dealt with the military. And then it also identifies some threats that we think the military should never respond to. For example, migration, climate change, pandemics, or social protests or unrest. Another of the main reasons we question military spending is because of the opportunity cost that it entails. We believe there'd be a huge peace dividend if we were to reallocate what we give to the military, and we've been under austerity policies and neoliberal policies for many years. We've seen now the consequences of our underfunded welfare state, and we believe now that a human security approach is more necessary than ever, because the real threats to people do not have to do with invasions or attacks in the military sense, but with having a house, having healthcare, having good education, having social services. Another reason for us to question military spending and to question militarization is that because we believe that it causes, it exacerbates, and it perpetuates global emergencies and tensions. We believe the current status quo, business as usual, it's supported by the military and by the use of force. This leads we know that it leads to increasingly obscene levels of violence and inequality. We believe we know that it's leading to the destruction of the environment and life support systems. And also we are very concerned that the military is presenting itself as the solution to these emergencies. We've seen it with the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen it with climate change. We've seen it with the militarization of borders. And now also recently in the United States, in Colombia, and many countries, we're seeing how the police is getting increasingly militarized, and the military is increasingly getting a police role to address social protests. And I'd like to share a quick presentation now, because it'll be more visual. Can you see this?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay. So this is from our campaign this year. As you know, in 2020, global military spending almost reached 2 trillion. Of that amount, more than half corresponds to member states' aggregated spending of NATO. It's 1.062 trillion. It's 56% of the global total, and we believe that there's no enemy, real or perceived, that can justify something like that. In this sense, I always say that it feels like we're preparing for an alien invasion, for a Mars attacks scenario, which is the only explanation that I can find to this level of spending. We try to bring attention to the distribution of all military expenditures, because the United States has 39% of it, and mostly countries in the global north are hoarding this military spending. But then in the first year of the pandemic, we found very necessary to talk about what that entailed in our budgets and what it could have meant if we were to better allocate this money. For example, when the World Health Organization was asking for the COVID-19 Solidarity Response Fund, which found a lot of problems and didn't get all the money and got it very late, only 0.03% of the global military spending would have secured that money. If we were to vaccinate everyone, it would only be 7% of what we spent last year. If we were to adapt to climate change, according to the Global Commission on Adaptation, what we spent last year will be enough, or 9% of what we're spending in the next 10 years will be enough to adapt to climate change. If we were to pay for the SDGs, the 10% could pay for the SDG 4 education. The price of military hegemony, the price of, I mean, what the United States spends more than the second country, China, it's already enough to pay for SDG 3 and 13, health and climate action in 1 year. So we believe that these comparisons are very painful, and it's necessary that we bring them on, because when we talk about figures, people get a bit confused, and we don't realize that this is paid with our taxes and it's made with our consent. As I said, in 2020, there was an increase of 13.6 over the previous year, which is heartbreaking in such a year. And we see that 12 NATO member states spend 12% or more of their GDP. This 12% guideline spending target, we still haven't found the rationale behind it. We cannot be sure how spending 2% of your GDP can ensure your security. This graphic it needs to be updated. Now we will see that 12 countries have reached this guideline. And I just want to conclude, I just want to bring attention to two recent statements by Jens Stoltenberg. First one talking about climate change and saying that climate change is a security issue, that it has to be dealt with the military. And also in a delirious moment saying that we need that his ambition is to significantly reduce military emissions, contributing to net zero. This is when CO2 emissions of the military are not even taken into account. So I don't know where they plan to start on that. And then on the COVID-19 pandemic, he also made some painful remarks. He was congratulating NATO for the job that they did, and they take credit for making sure that the health crisis didn't become a security crisis. And somehow getting credit for it and justifying the existence of NATO because of how they behaved during the pandemic, not being aware that the resources that we dedicated to military force and military projection could have been better managed in other civil sectors. Well, you've already talked about alternatives, so I don't want to elaborate more on that. But yes, just to say that any alternative to militarism, it's more peaceful, more sustainable, diverse, and just. And lastly, I'd like to invite you to join our campaign this year on the Global Days of Action on Military Spending from April 10th to 17th. We have these two slogans. We managed to get more than 150 actions in 30 different countries all across the world. And we believe that our movement in this sense is growing, and that we need to keep changing this course. These are some of the actions that took place. And also invite you to Barcelona, this Congress of the IPB that is happening from the 15th to the 17th of October. And there is going to be a nice gathering of the peace movement for us to share strategies, experiences, and get strong again. And you're all most welcome to join us, either physically there in Barcelona or virtually. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kike, for your presentation and final invitation to the IPB Barcelona Congress. And now we have the time for questions and answers, and even comments if someone wants to say something. We already received some questions that I'm going to read. First one is for Tamara. Tamara, someone is asking about how the United Nations can turn into an ally for the peace movement, knowing that the 5 permanent members of its Security Council.
Yes, I appreciate the fact that there are some challenges with the United Nations, especially with the UN Security Council. There absolutely needs to be reform and greater democratization happening in the United Nations. But the United Nations, especially the UN General Assembly, remains the place where all of the countries come together. They all equally have one vote, and it's the most important institution that we have for global cooperation and collaboration. And it is so evident to me, following NATO 2030's a plan, and looking at the development of NATO over the past few years, that NATO, which is an institution of just 30 members, dominated and dictated by the United States, is undermining and circumventing the United Nations, and we should be very concerned about that, and we need to prevent that. We don't want NATO to displace the United Nations, and that's what the intention is. That's what NATO is doing. So, I would like us to put our energies, of course, in global solidarity, in collaborating, among the peace movements, but also to try to work in partnership somehow with the United Nations, because I explained in my remarks as well, the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals really is the human security agenda that we need to try to implement. This is why it's so essential to stop NATO.
Thank you very much. I don't know if the person that wrote the question have more insights or wants to add something else. If not, I'm gonna move to the next question. This is a long question, sorry, and it's for Micaela. Mark Sayers asked to Micaela about the situation in Africa. He says that his question is related to Africa because NATO and countries like UK, France, and USA see China and the China Belt Road Initiative as a direct threat to their neoliberal policies in Africa. And he talks about some important issues like funding mega mining projects, land grabs, and resource extraction, which now China directly threatens with the China Road Belt Initiative. He asked concretely, how do the peace movement esteem the new arms race, which this planet cannot sustain, and what do you see in the near future what could happen with these kind of situations that could increase wars and over resources?
Thanks for the question. Very long and very different components to it. But part of what we also discuss in this dossier, which I'm punting because it really does give a more detailed analysis that I can provide right now. But as someone who's living on the African continent, who has seen the experiences of colonialism, I can tell you that the experience of China and Africa is totally different from the US and Western states have been, whether it's in the past or in the present. Let me give you a few examples. As in the 400 plus years of Portuguese colonialism, do you think one higher education school was built in Cabo Verde, in Cape Verde, the island on the West African coast? No, not a single school was built. But do you know what China did recently? They recently completed a second tier level university, the first university in Cabo Verde. So what people need to understand is the BRI, regardless of if you agree or disagree with the politics of China, the approach of infrastructural-led loans and development in the African continent has given Africans a totally different material reality that the US cannot even begin to compare with. People point to the Chinese base, military base in Djibouti, right? In the whole of the US's military presence in Djibouti, do you think they've built one school, one clinic, one road, one dam, one train that connects Djibouti to Ethiopia? No. In one of the conflict areas between Djibouti and Ethiopia, where we see the US increasing military presence, China was building water infrastructure, was building housing infrastructure. And of course, we're not naive about the fact that they have interest in, the extraction of mineral resources. They want to build favorable relationships with African countries. We have a imbalanced level of negotiation. We've seen countries like Ethiopia completely transform, where now they're able to actually, balance their different interests and are able to choose if they want to take a neoliberal path and have deals with the US. But nonetheless, the infrastructural development provided by China's exchange is what has enabled them to be more self-determining agents in the types of international relationships they have. What this means, though, however, for the peace movements, at least in Africa, is unfortunately the case is that China doesn't intervene with the sovereignty of various nations. Our nations don't look out for the interests of its people. And so for us, those involved with social movements across the world, we need to build a counteroffensive to the actual struggles for power in our countries. So for example, in Ghana, the Socialist Forum of Ghana, they were pushing, and through popular mobilizations outside of them, were pushing in 2016 to push back against new agreements that the Ghanaian government was going to have that would basically allow for the US to operate freely as they want and use the one of the international airports to transport their various goods and services around that region. People were pushing back, but it had to come from the base, because ultimately African leaders don't act in the interests, and we need to figure out our strategies. I can't necessarily speak across the continent in broad sweeps, but it has to come from below. And so for peace movements, we need to organize within our countries, but connected to this international struggle against these different initiatives, which is why I'm glad to be able to be speaking to people located, I guess, predominantly in the North, because as many of you know, even the question of the migrant crisis, the European Union has increasingly, through NATO, displaced that and has actually pushed that responsibility further and further, even from the visual view of the people living in the south of Europe, because now the border that used to be with Spain and with the kind of southern countries has now been pushed further down in the Sahel, where from Mauritania to Chad, now we see the French, the US have created a border in Africa to prevent the migration of people, right? And these are the same people who are migrating due to the neoliberal austerities that have only been, worsening since the 1980s. So that's just one thing I wanted to add in terms of my contribution that I didn't get to share. But the question of China, it's very important that we don't feed into Western imperialist discourse, because land grabs, things like that have actually been, organizations like CARI at Johns Hopkins University have found critical evidence that completely debunks some of these myths. And it's also our job in our various places to be ensuring that we have the clear and correct information, despite the fact that Chinese interests might not always serve African interests.
Thank you very much, Micaela. And I think like your answer has bring more questions around the issue. But yeah, we have too many questions, and there are two questions formulated by Martel, and I think all the speakers can answer them, maybe. So the first one is, the 9 nuclear weapons states, are not they a priority because they feed their military industrial complexes and don't want to back off? How to mobilize citizens on this scale global? So I don't know who wants to answer this one about why the 9 nuclear weapon states should be a priority of our actions, and how can we mobilize citizens on this kind of movement in a global scale?
I'm happy to chime in on that relating to the nuclear. As I said in my speech, NATO is the largest nuclear spender and has the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons throughout the world. And so I think the part of the kind of argument for the focus on NATO would be that really in a common security policy, or to help other nations feel more secure, those who have the largest capabilities, the most destructive weapons, need to be taking a lead in the in nuclear disarmament and in general disarmament. So I think that really is one of the reasons for focusing on NATO as the center of that. That's not to say, nuclear weapon states throughout the rest of the world are also not a dangerous threat that needs to be dealt with. The TPNW and the approach of that really is for international nuclear disarmament. NATO has the power to really show its goodwill and be a figure that helps to ease the concerns of the nuclear threats and eventually help with the overall reduction of nuclear weapons. But in order to play a role in that, they can't be telling other nations, get rid of your nuclear weapons while they remain armed to the teeth. So that is, I think, a large policy on there. I think there was also then a question about how the nuclear weapons-free zones and how to increase enthusiasm for nuclear-free weapon zones. One really great initiative that has been building some momentum this year in Europe is a nuclear-free Europe, which calls for nuclear disarmament in Europe, both of the nuclear sharing countries and, of course, the nuclear countries in Europe. And that's a movement that really is taking actions all throughout the continent to try to decrease nuclear weapons and create a nuclear weapons-free zone in Europe, kind of a legacy of earlier attempts that were made in the 1980s. So I think that's one way that we can definitely increase the excitement for nuclear disarmament. That's very important, and nuclear weapons-free zones. There's the Middle East Treaty Organization that is working not only for nuclear disarmaments, but larger disarmaments in the Middle East. That's also gaining some momentum and is doing some great work in that region. There's also several nuclear-free zones that exist, throughout Latin America, throughout Africa, and in parts of Central and Northern Asia as well, including Mongolia. And I think education and helping people to understand what these nuclear weapon-free zones actually mean is also a great way to increase activism for those zones. I would like to say, I forgot to mention it in my speech earlier, but another great opportunity to kind of build excitement and momentum will happen this October in Barcelona. The International Peace Bureau has our World Peace Congress, and we have a couple sessions that will touch on nuclear weapons-free zones, as well as several sessions on nuclear abolition that will be in there, as well as several sessions that will bring up the theme of NATO as the aggressor in many ways.
Can I quickly just add something to what Sean said? That NATO, with or without nuclear weapons, is a no-go. Like, if NATO didn't have any more nuclear weapons, we still don't want NATO. Like, the struggle against NATO is the same struggle against nuclear weapons. And I wish ICANN took a firmer position against NATO, not just against nuclear weapons. In Canada, some peace activists say, oh, Canada just needs to work within NATO to get rid of nuclear weapons. Well, Canada has tried that for 40 years and it's not working. And Canada isn't joining the new nuclear ban treaty because of our membership in the alliance. So now in Canada, what we're saying is no to nuclear weapons and no to NATO. So the struggle against the worst weapons of mass destruction is also a struggle against the NATO military alliance. And I think we need to start making that connection. And I think we need to start having the courage to speak out clearly and unequivocally against NATO, not just against nuclear weapons. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I don't know if someone else wants to say something about this. If not, I'm gonna move to the next question. And the next question is about France. Someone congratulates the presentations because they bring coherence to better perceive a particularly dangerous situation with the armed wing constituted by NATO And this person asked why in France these informations, interpretations are not disseminated by activists and organizations to add. Maybe someone from the audience can also answer this question, because I think it's very broad, and if we have someone from France, that would be extremely useful. Alain, you want to answer the question? Can you unmute yourself, please? Thank you.
Oui, je crois que les organisations de paix, aussi certains partis de gauche en France, essaient de diffuser largement ces informations. Mais il est vrai qu'en France, il n'y a plus de base de l'OTAN, et par conséquent, les Français ressentent sans doute moins le danger de l'OTAN, et ils croient même, certains croient encore que la France n'est plus dans l'OTAN. Cela remonte à l'année 1966, où le général de Gaulle a rompu avec les structures militaires de l'OTAN. La France a quitté le commandement militaire de l'OTAN. Et beaucoup de Français sont restés sur cette idée-là que nous n'étions plus militairement dans l'OTAN. C'est faux, malheureusement, c'est faux, puisque depuis le président Sarkozy, la France est partie intégrante de nouveau du commandement intégré militaire de l'OTAN. Mais c'est vrai que la représentation reste chez les Français que nous sommes un peu à part dans l'OTAN et pas vraiment dans l'OTAN. Nous faisons tout ce que nous pouvons pour diffuser les informations. Je dois dire que cette année, les grandes manœuvres de l'OTAN qui ont fait que pour la première fois depuis 1966, des troupes américaines ont débarqué du matériel dans des ports français, à Calais, à La Rochelle, ce sont des ports français. Donc, on a vu pour la première fois le retour des armées de l'OTAN, des armées américaines dans le cadre de l'OTAN, et cela nous permet effectivement de diffuser de nouvelles informations. De même que Paris a été survolé par des B-52 la semaine dernière ou il y a 2 semaines. Bon, ces éléments nous facilitent, disons, nos explications sur l'action de la France au sein de l'OTAN. Mais le monsieur qui pose la question a raison, il faut faire davantage, il faut essayer c'est tout le sens de l'action que mène le mouvement de la paix et aussi le collectif français qui réunit quand même 60 organisations politiques, syndicales et associatives, le collectif français qui s'appelle Non à l'OTAN. Donc, nous faisons ce que nous pouvons et j'espère qu'il nous aidera pour continuer et augmenter. Mais c'est vrai que les médias en France ne nous aident pas beaucoup. Ça, il faut le souligner. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Alain, for that amazing answer. I think you provide a really well insight of what's happening in France and these kind of issues that happens there. And we have other questions. This is regarding the UK. And someone asked, what do you really think about the UK government and the use of the G7 to muster an alliance against China? And I think same, like if someone from the audience from UK wants to provide some context and explain or answer this question, you are more than welcome, or even our speakers. Or maybe, I don't know, the person that wrote the question, maybe he can talk and take the word. I think Rainer wants to speak. Yes, Rainer, the
When
first.
no one will answer, I'm astonished that you don't want to answer. I can give some elements of the answer. You know, NATO was founded in encircling Russia, the Soviet Union, as a big enemy in the Cold War period. And now there is a new enemy coming up. And even when Stoltenberg today is formulating it a little bit more cautious, the goal is to encircling China by military bases, by submarines, by maneuvers, and by using supporting countries in the area to build new military coalition and alliances. One is the so-called Quad alliance with India, South Korea, Japan, and Australia, which has a huge military component. The other is a strong work together also with the Philippines and Indonesia. And the goal is very easy: to reduce the influence of China in the world, to ban China, and to force China also to enlarge their military activities, which is stealing possibilities for civilian development and for international help. The reason behind is the fight or the competition between the US and China, the rivalry about who is the first superpower in the world. This rivalry under the actual condition is never peaceful, and it creates big dangers for a big war. And what the US is doing there is putting always oil in the fire to enlarge this competition. And the interesting point for NATO is, what is the name NATO? North Atlantic Treaty Organizations. That is a lie. NATO is the biggest military alliance in the world, not only in the tradition of the Cold War period fighting against Russia, but also enlarging these fights against China. And this makes it even more obviously that we have to do everything for abolishing NATO, and that we as a peace movement have to develop new coalitions with the peace movement in Asia, above all in Asia, for common peace actions against this military enlargement of NATO all around the world.
Thank you, Rainer. I think Özlem wants to provide also an answer, so the floor is.
Ja, danke schön. Vielleicht kann ich ganz kurz noch ergänzen. Natürlich kann ich nicht aus britischer Sicht hier eine Einschätzung geben, weil ich nicht aus Großbritannien komme, aber ich kann vielleicht doch noch mal darauf hindeuten, dass es ja nicht nur Großbritannien ist. Also ich glaube, was wir sehen müssen in den Diskussionen und den Veränderungen der NATO, auch mit Blick darauf, was in den vergangenen Jahren unter Trump war und aktuell war und warum jetzt der Akzent Richtung China nochmal gelegt wird, dass wir hier nochmal eine klarere Analyse brauchen. Also als erstes ist ja, glaube ich, meines Erachtens klar, dass nicht nur Großbritannien, sondern alle ökonomischen Weltmächte im Moment mit China in einer großen ökonomischen Konkurrenz sind. Die Kollegin, die Gewerkschafterin aus Südafrika hat ja auch nochmal darauf hingewiesen, dass China dort große Investitionen tätigt. Sie hat aus ihrer Perspektive gesagt, es sind aber auch infrastrukturelle Investitionen. Wir wissen, China beutet auch unsere Ressourcen aus, genauso wie der Westen, aber sie investieren, deshalb sind sie, vielleicht, wenn ich sie richtig verstanden habe, uns willkommener als der Westen, der nur ausbeutet, ohne uns eine Infrastruktur zu geben. Das heißt, mit China haben wir eine wachsende ökonomische Macht, die tagtäglich größer wird, rapider auch wächst und auch Investitionen in der Welt betreibt. China ist natürlich nicht, wie die NATO per se sagt, eine ökonomische Systemkonkurrenz, denn in China haben wir jetzt auch nicht eine ganz andere Wirtschaftsweise, als immer weiter den offenen Markt zu haben. Aber der Westen sieht eine Gefahr für sich in China, denn auch die USA weiß natürlich, wenn sie politisch die Nummer 1 in der Welt sein muss, und dafür ist doch die NATO auch ganz, ganz wichtig für die USA, dann muss sie auch ökonomisch die Nummer 1 sein können. Und ähnlich geht es, glaube ich, auch anderen Mächten in der Welt. Also ich nehme mal die Beispiele Frankreich und Deutschland. Ich komme selber aus Deutschland. Auch diese sehen natürlich ihre ökonomischen Einflusssphären gefährdet, wenn China immer weiter investiert. Also wird jetzt eine Einigkeit zwischen den NATO-Mitgliedstaaten gesucht, um gemeinsam vorgehen zu können. gegen China. Nicht etwa, weil man irgendwie selber eine alternativere Politik hätte. Im Gegenteil, man muss ja die Westpolitik und auch die imperiale Westpolitik stark kritisieren, sondern weil man sagt, uns steht der größere Teil des Kuchens zu. Und das ist, glaube ich, eine große Gefahr. Und auch wenn ich gucke, dass in Europa immer verstärkt auch aufgerüstet wird, dass ich gucke, dass in der NATO immer verstärkt aufgerüstet wird, dann ist ja das Signal, was wir sehen, dass Vorbereitungen durchaus für symmetrische Kriege laufen. Also wenn ich eine NATO-Einschätzung gebe von vor 10 Jahren, dann würde ich sagen, die NATO war dafür bekannt, asymmetrische Kriege zu führen. Libyen, Afghanistan, verschiedene Länder, wo wir es gesehen haben. Und im Moment rüstet die NATO, aber auch die EU zusammen mit der NATO, aber auch abgekoppelt davon zum Beispiel auf für mögliche symmetrische Kriege. Und das ist die eigentliche Gefahr. Was wir festhalten können, ist, vielleicht, manchmal haben wir es in den vergangenen Jahren als Friedensbewegung nicht genug unterstrichen, aber Kriege werden geführt für Absatzmärkte, für ökonomische Interessen, die zusammenhängen mit Geopolitik, selbstverständlich, aber für diese Interessen. Und wir sehen jetzt eine Eskalation symmetrischer Art genau für diese Interessen. Und da ist es noch lauter, also noch wichtiger, lauter zu sagen, wir wollen keine Kriege für irgendwelche Kapitalinteressen, denn die Völker in der Welt, egal ob in Europa, in China, in den USA oder wo auch immer, haben ja nichts davon, wenn die Konzerne sich um ihre Absatzmärkte streiten. Wir profitieren nicht davon. Es sind die Kapitalinteressen, die hier verteidigt werden. Vielleicht muss man das nochmal unterstreichen. Und deshalb ist das, glaube ich, auch ein Grund, warum Herr Macron, der noch letztes Jahr meinte, die NATO ist hirntot, heute vielleicht nochmal versucht, die engere Zusammenarbeit in der NATO zu finden.
Thank you very much, Özlem. I hear like Ludo wants to continue what Rainer was talking about. So Ludo, the floor is yours.
Yeah, since Rainer thought I should react it, I agree totally with what Rainer said, and I just want to add that you know, the UK published not a few months ago a so-called integrated review, which is of course because of the post-Brexit policy. You know, when the UK left the European Union, they had to redevelop their own positions towards the foreign security and defense policy. And so remarkable is that it reflects a kind of desire to the neo-colonial or the colonial era of the UK, in my view, and as well to establish the UK as a major military power. And you know, it's even in the report that the Indo-Pacific, for example, is for the UK, and they say it themselves. It's not me, but it's in the report that it's critical to the UK economy. And that's why they need also to develop this military wing to this, let's say, imperial, let's use the word as it is, imperial economical ambitions. And this, the other thing, of course, is which is very important, and it's a negative development, and it shows the arrogance of these major powers. That is that in the same period, the UK also announced the increasement of the nuclear warheads to 260, which is the first time that this happens, in the sense that this is clearly in violation with the Non-Proliferation Treaty that asks already more than 50 years not to arm, but to disarm, to promise to, until we come into a nuclear free world. And UK is just doing, you know, is violating this treaty. And nobody is discussing it. It's not a big question in the Security Council. It's totally different treated as, for example, what happened with Iran, or which has been sanctioned for whatever, all kind of reasons, and it's connected to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So this is a very dangerous development. It's a kind of new arrogance of major powers. Just to do as they want and to legitimize it, even when it's opposed to the international law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ludo. I see Tom wants to say something.
Well, for what it's worth, we are fully opposed to what our awful UK government is trying to do with the increases in the nuclear arsenal. We have had seminars about the illegality of this, and we hope to be having discussions on how to take our UK government decision to the United Nations. I'm sure our officers in the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament will have more to say, but I really admire your understanding, Luda, of the integrated review. It was delayed for a year because of COVID, but of course, the military spending in the UK has affected our healthcare, it has affected our performance in combating COVID, and through that route, parliamentarians are now challenging our Prime Minister and his officials. I have to say their challenge to the visit of HMS Queen Elizabeth to the South China Sea was hardly questioned at all. And of course, over the next 6 months, we'll be watching what on earth happens in the South China Sea as it gets there. It's a very worrying development, and it was exacerbated by discussions at the G7. So thanks very much for your understanding in these countries of our situation in the UK. It's not a very good situation that we're in, I can assure you.
Thank you very much. And when we are going to the end of this webinar, we would like to first thank the organizers, the No to War, No to NATO Worldwide Network. And I would also like to thank all the amazing panelists for their presentations and all the attendees for being part of this action against NATO. And I also going to take the opportunity to invite you all to register at our next event that is happening at 5 p.m. Central European summertime, Voices Against NATO. And we will wait you all there. And thank you very much for joining us. And sorry for the attendees that had more questions, but because of the time, we couldn't answer all of them. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. It was very good. It was very interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Jessica, for the good moderation. It was perfect.
Thank you. It was very nice event. Bye.
Bye.